The day the snow punched through the Thompson boy's roof and killed his baby sister was the same day Eliza Cooper laid the first board across the rafters of her old barn. Not one settler asked what she was building. They only laughed, from porches, from wagons, from the church steps. They chuckled behind gloves and scarves and muttered things like, "Poor woman's gone and cracked," or "What kind of idiot builds on top of a barn?" But Eliza didn't explain herself, not that first week. Her hands were cracked to bleeding from hauling the lumber up by rope, and her boys, Thomas and Eli, were hauling sawdust out of their socks every night. She didn't build to please them. She built because she had no other way. Her cabin, the first one, the ground one, had gone cold in November. The draft didn't come from the door or the windows, or even the gaps in the logs, though they all had gaps now. It came from the ground itself. Frost moved up through the dirt floor, crawled into the bedding, whispered into the boys' lungs at night. The potbelly stove she'd inherited from her husband smoked too much and burned too fast. And with no man left to split a winter's worth of wood, Eliza knew in her bones that cabin would not see them through the freeze. But the barn, that old crooked roof thing the mule used to sleep in, had one strange blessing. The loft sat warmer than the cabin, warmer by far. The heat trapped in that hayloft, just under the high pitch of the roof, had saved the mule once during a past blizzard. Eliza remembered it plain. That was the same year her husband died of the coughing fever. One bed, no heat, 3 of them sick and shivering. The mule hadn't been seen for 2 days. They figured it froze to death somewhere in the pasture. But when her oldest boy opened the barn to drag out planks for kindling, they found the beast up in the loft, tail twitching, breath steaming, eyes wide and alive. The animal had climbed through a broken hay chute and curled into the straw. It survived where the cabin barely hadn't. That was when the idea had seeded itself in Eliza's mind. She never said it aloud, not till that winter. By the time the other settlers saw her frame going up over the barn roof, they hadn't known about the nights she spent standing over her boys while they wheezed. They hadn't seen her tying a rag over their faces to keep the frost from cracking their lips in their sleep. They didn't know that for the past 2 weeks, she'd been testing heat with her bare hand on the ground inside the cabin, only to feel frost sting her palm by dawn. She tried building a false floor. Still the cold climbed through, but the top of the barn, that old hayloft roof, stayed dry and warm, and so she had no choice. Eliza Cooper would build a cabin on top of it, because she had no man, no help, just the 2 boys, and whatever cleverness was left in her. The frame started as 4 vertical beams, driven through gaps in the old loft joists, bolted into the barn's support structure, with hardware salvaged from a collapsed bridge up by Hemlock Ridge. She'd taken her husband's old tool chest, the one he'd built during his courting days, and used its last bits of forged iron to fasten her dream in place. She climbed each day up a ladder made of fence rails, and each night she climbed back down with the wind clawing at her cheeks, her coat heavy with snowmelt. The boys hauled scrap up with a rope and pulley she'd rigged from a bell tower mechanism nobody wanted. At night, they sat in the corner of the barn floor, shivering under blankets, watching the cabin rise above them like a second chance. None of them smiled, but none of them cried either. One Sunday, the preacher's wife rode past and paused, staring up at the half-formed shack on the barn roof. She asked gently if Eliza needed prayers. Eliza said, "Not unless you got extra nails hidden in that Bible," and she kept hammering. That week, the real cold began. It rolled in sudden, like a black curtain drawn across the valley. Settlers woke to find wells frozen, soup pots cracked with ice. An ox froze standing upright in the Connolly's field. The wind scraped skin red in seconds. Fires burned all day, yet never kept the frost from the bedclothes. 2 children died in the valley that week. One of them, the Thompson baby, whose crib lay beneath a roof beam that snapped from the ice. The whole town went quiet after that, except for Eliza's hammer, still rising and falling atop the barn, like the tick of a stubborn clock. By the 2nd week, her structure stood complete. It wasn't pretty. It looked like a mistake, like something slapped together in a drunken rush. The roof pitched uneven. The boards didn't match. One window was a stained glass panel rescued from a burnt-out chapel. But it held, and when the first storm dumped its weight onto the valley, a thick, choking snow with winds that howled like wolves, the barn roof groaned but didn't split. Her structure held, and inside that strange little loft cabin, Eliza and her boys sat warm. She'd built the walls with a double thickness of boards, with packed straw and mud between, like some settler women used for earth wall insulation. The floor sat above the hayloft itself, which she left full of straw and layered with flat stones she'd carried up by hand from the creek bed. She'd learned the trick from a half-deaf trapper, who once said warm rocks underfoot made all the difference when snow came early. She doubted him then. She didn't now. Her feet had stopped going numb at night. On the 3rd night of the storm, Thomas woke up sweating. He kicked off his blankets, cheeks flushed. "Mama," he said, confused. It's hot. Eliza climbed from her own pallet, knelt, and pressed her hand to the floor. It was warm, not just warmer than freezing, truly warm. She put her hand to the glass in the little window. Outside, snow blew horizontal, screaming past like banshees. But inside, warmth, true warmth. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was failing them. That week, 3 families tried to leave the valley, headed for the city, hoping for help. They turned back after the first pass. The drifts were too high. One wagon shattered its axle. A man lost 2 toes. They returned cold, defeated. And Eliza, the widow they'd laughed at, had not only stayed, she'd warmed. Neighbors began knocking. Some asked to see, some asked to measure. One old rancher, missing half his teeth, climbed up the ladder and stared slack-jawed into her rooftop cabin like it was some holy place. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "You're up in the sky and sleeping like angels, huh?" She didn't tell them everything. Not how she'd cut and fit each board herself. Not how she'd lifted a whole stove up by rope, using a rig she didn't know how to explain. She didn't tell them how close Eli came to frostbite or how many nights she thought of burying them all together rather than letting them freeze apart. She only smiled tight and said, "Well, the roof's warmer than the ground." But the laughter stopped. No more chuckles, no more muttered jokes. Even the storekeep who once offered her a real man's help now nodded and tipped his hat when she walked in. And then came the 4th week, when the second storm hit, colder than the first, and everything changed again. The second storm didn't arrive like the first. It didn't howl or scream or beat its chest. It crept, quiet as death. It slipped across the ridgeline on a Sunday evening and laid itself over the valley like a shroud. It brought no thunder, no warning wind, just a stillness that stopped every chicken from pecking, froze water where it stood, and turned every man's breath into a trembling cloud of doubt. Eliza knew it had arrived when the barn groaned, not from wind, but from weight. She felt it in her back as she bent to ladle stew into the boys' bowls. That ominous, slow bending of ancient wood, the kind that said the world outside had turned heavier than it ought to be. Eli looked up first. "Is it the roof?" She didn't answer. She moved to the trapdoor in the floor of their loft cabin, the one she'd rigged to drop hay or speak to the barn floor below. She pushed it open and peered into the darkness beneath. No wind, no whistle of air through the boards, just silence and the heavy hush of settling snow atop a world trying not to collapse. All through the valley that night, the roofs began to snap. Not loudly, no, they came down soft, like knees buckling. The Blaylock's barn caved first, burying their milk cow in slush and splinters. Then came the Easton's porch, which cracked like a pistol shot and slid into their root cellar. By midnight, 2 cabins had lost chimneys, and the sound of shovels echoed faintly through the storm. Men, climbing onto roofs, trying to shovel the weight free while the storm kept laying it back down. But up in Eliza's barn roof cabin, no snow lay, not yet. Her high-pitched roof, steep and narrow, had been built like a tent, not by accident. She didn't know architecture, but she knew how the wind moved through the hayloft and how snow never lingered there. She'd mimicked the angle, used split planks sanded and tarred from salvaged fencing, and layered them with muslin soaked in ash water and beeswax. It was a trick passed down from a German widow who used to live in a cave hut along the eastern ridge. Folk thought the woman mad too, until she survived 5 winters longer than any of her neighbors. That night, Eliza didn't sleep. She sat with her back to the wall, listening to the faint sound of boards failing in the distance, listening to her boys snore soft and warm under 3 quilts, listening to the stove hiss and pop as if it were trying to whisper secrets. The storm didn't come with fanfare. It just sat like a weight on the chest, and by morning, the valley had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that follows after something breaks. When Eliza opened the trapdoor that dawn, she expected to see the barn floor. She didn't. The entire chute was blocked with snow, packed tight. The door opened only a hand's width before hitting a wall of icy white. Her first thought wasn't fear, it was calculation. She looked at her boys, still asleep, and then at the stack of wood. Half a cord left, water in 2 buckets, food for 5 days if she rationed. The flue was still open, the chimney still breathing. For now. But she knew they were trapped, so she didn't scream, didn't even sigh. She latched the trapdoor, reinforced it with a board across the underside, and began boiling water. She set bread to warm. By the time the boys stirred, the cabin felt like a sanctuary. That afternoon someone knocked. It was a sound she hadn't expected to hear. Not in this storm, not through snow that thick, not that high up. It came not from the trapdoor but the window, a sharp rapping. 3 times. She turned, heart galloping, and saw the edge of a face peeking through the colored glass. A mittened hand knocked again. Thomas scrambled to open it, and a blast of cold slapped them all in the face as the pain opened. But what stunned them wasn't the cold, it was the sight. 3 figures stood huddled on the slope of the barn roof. 1 man, 2 children. The man's beard was frozen stiff, his eyes were red-rimmed. One of the children, a girl of maybe 7, was barefoot, her feet wrapped in a shawl. The other child was unconscious, slung across the man's back. "We saw the smoke," he rasped. Eliza didn't ask. She reached for the rope ladder and lowered it over the side of the cabin's narrow porch. It had only ever been decorative, a few boards with a railing on one side to keep her boys from falling. Now it served as a lifeline. The man staggered up first, handing the girl up with shaking arms. Eliza caught her, bundled her into the warm cabin. The man followed, knees buckling. When he laid the unconscious child on the floor, only then did Eliza see it was his son. Cheeks blue, breath faint. She thrust him toward the stove. Over the next hour, she fed them broth and dried berries soaked soft in boiled water. She had no idea how they'd reached the roof. They'd tunneled, the man said, dug through the snow from their own collapsed home. The roof had come down in the night, killed his wife. He and the children escaped through a side wall, spent hours crawling to the nearest light, the flicker of her stovepipe against the snow. "We were walking up the hill when I realized the smoke wasn't coming from a chimney," he said, voice hoarse. "It was higher. That's when I saw it. Your house up here." He didn't laugh when he said it. He wept. 2 more families came the next day, not through the barn. That way was still snowed shut. They came up by digging stairs into the drifts that had settled against the side of the barn. Word had spread, somehow. 1 family brought a sack of oats, another brought a rabbit. No one asked permission. They climbed, knocked, begged, and she let them in. By the end of the week, 10 people lived in that rooftop cabin. Eliza, her 2 boys, the bearded man and his children, the Crawfords, and the blind elder Mr. Pilcher, who had been carried up wrapped in quilts like a corpse that hadn't yet died. He thanked her with every breath. They took shifts sleeping, some curled by the stove, others in the corners. 1 woman never stopped crying. The bearded man, his name was Jonas, spent his waking hours melting snow in iron kettles for water and reinforcing the narrow outer porch with planks. And through it all, the snow kept falling. But the cabin stayed warm. It wasn't magic. It was built to trap heat and shed snow. The pitch of the roof, the double walls, the hot stones underfoot, and the packed bodies all breathing warm air into one another. It created a pocket, a womb in the sky. No other structure in the valley had anything like it. Chimneys below smoked but froze. Roofs caved. But this awkward, ugly, impossible-looking shack on the roof of a barn had become the last light in the valley. By the 10th day, the storm broke. It didn't end in a blaze or a sudden melt. It just thinned. The wind died. The clouds turned to mist. Snow hardened into crusty silence. And slowly, like men waking from a shared nightmare, the settlers emerged. Eliza was the first to climb down. She used the porch ladder, hacked a tunnel through the snow with a borrowed axe, and carved her way back into the barn, through a drift nearly 9 feet tall. She stepped inside and stared at the ruin of her old ground cabin through the barn's side door. The windows had shattered. The roof bore a foot of ice. Inside, frost glittered like diamonds over her old quilts. The stove lay broken, split down the side, like it had screamed itself in half. She turned back. The barn had held. The loft above had endured. But more than that, it had saved, and by the following week, settlers stopped laughing. Some asked for her help building similar things. 1 man tried to buy the plans, as if there were any. A few called her a genius. Others still didn't say anything, just nodded and tipped hats as she passed. But there were always those who couldn't bear to admit they'd been wrong. 1 woman muttered that it wasn't proper, living above animals. Another said she must have had help from men and was just pretending she'd done it alone. But none of that mattered, because by then, Eliza Cooper's cabin had already become legend, a story whispered at firesides, a tale of the widow who slept above the snow while the rest of them froze beneath it. But peace never lasts long in the frontier, and one night, just as the thaw began, a fire broke out in the valley, and it didn't start in the cabins below. It started in the barn. It began with the smell of smoke, but not the good kind, not the woody, steady kind that wafted from a cooking fire or the rich scent of logs smoldering inside a stove. This was sharp, dry, bitter in the nostrils and sour down the throat. Eliza's eyes snapped open before her mind had even caught up. 1 glance at the sleeping forms around her. Thomas curled by the wall, Eli slumped against the beam, Jonas on the floor with a blanket over the girl, and she knew something was wrong. Very wrong. She bolted upright and pressed her palm to the floorboards, which no longer hummed with the usual warmth from the rocks and hay beneath. Instead, there was a sickly heat radiating upward, unnatural, too hot, and then it hit, the unmistakable crackle from below, muffled at first but growing louder, fire, chewing through dry timber, feeding on straw, licking at beams. "Elijah, Thomas, up, now!" Her voice was steel, and both boys shot up at once. Around the cabin, the others stirred, confused, grumbling, too bleary to understand, until Jonas sat up, sniffed, and his eyes widened. "Smoke," he said, and then the screaming began. Someone had already thrown open the window. Icy air rushed in, but with it came a plume of smoke that curled in the wind like a black rope. From the edge of the rooftop cabin porch, Jonas leaned out and looked down toward the barn's base, then turned, his face chalk white. "It's underneath! The barn's on fire!" Panic set in instantly. Voices cried out. One woman began praying aloud. Pilcher, the blind elder, clutched at the air, lost. The children started sobbing, their tiny lungs catching in fear. But Eliza didn't flinch. Her mind moved like clockwork. "How high's the drift?" she snapped. Jonas leaned again. "Still up past the middle window, maybe 8 feet. That's enough." She was already moving to the corner, dragging the thick quilts off the sleeping mats, bundling them into ropes. "We drop the children down first, then the elders. Everyone else follows. We jump if we have to." "We'll freeze," someone protested. "You'll burn if you stay." That ended the discussion. They worked fast, not with finesse, not with silence, but with desperation. Eliza and Jonas tied a crude sling from the quilts and lowered Eli first. He dangled for a moment, yelping as his boots struck the icy snowdrift, but he was alive. Thomas followed, then the Crawford girl, then Pilcher, half-conscious and mumbling prayers. The smoke thickened. Beneath their feet, the floor began to moan, not from footsteps, but from heat warping the boards. It wouldn't last much longer. When Jonas dropped down into the snow with the last child, Eliza was the only one left in the cabin. She looked around once, at the stove that had kept them alive, the cracked window that had let the cold in but kept the air moving, the lopsided beam she'd hammered in on her knees in the middle of the night. She pressed a hand to the wall and whispered something no one could hear. Then she climbed onto the porch railing and jumped. She landed hard, shoulder first, into the snowbank, but didn't stop moving. Jonas grabbed her arm and hauled her upright. Around them, smoke now belched from every slat in the barn wall. Flames flickered in the gaps between boards, hungrily climbing. And above, up where her strange little sky cabin had sat strong through 2 storms, the first hints of fire began curling into the roofline. They didn't have long. The group stumbled down the slope away from the barn, boots slipping on ice, hands grabbing at each other to keep from falling. Eliza didn't look back until they'd made it past the old fence line. Then she turned. The barn groaned, timbers snapping in sequence like a beast cracking its knuckles. The blaze had swallowed the hayloft first, which meant the cabin, her cabin, was now burning from below. Then came the collapse. The entire north side caved in, the structure pancaking inward. Sparks exploded into the night air, floating up in red spirals. For a brief moment, the flames cast golden light across the frozen field, illuminating the stunned faces of the survivors. And just like that, the place that had held them warm for weeks, the place the town once mocked and then came to rely on, was gone. They stood there, huddled in the cold, watching it burn. No one spoke. It wasn't until the fire died down to embers and ash that they found the tracks. Eliza was the first to notice. Her eyes, still adjusting to the flickering shadows, caught something strange in the snow just behind the barn. Boot prints. Not from her, not from the children. Not even from Jonas or the Crawfords. These were large, heavy, made by a man, and not one from their group. She followed them, slowly, her breath catching. They led behind the barn, circled the base once, and ended near a corner where the snow had been dug away, dug in a clear, deliberate scoop. Beside it, near the stacked firewood, she found the broken flask. Oil, lamp oil. Her stomach turned. Someone had lit it. Someone had poured oil through a gap in the boards and tossed in fire. This wasn't an accident. It was arson. By morning, the news spread. And not just about the fire, about the footprints, the oil, the deliberate trail. The valley, once held in unity by shared frost, now split into suspicion. Because if someone had burned the barn, that meant someone wanted Eliza's cabin gone, not just destroyed, erased. She didn't speak much that day. She helped Jonas salvage what tools hadn't melted in the barn's lower storage. She helped dig out her quilts, now half charred and crusted in ice. She didn't weep, she didn't shout, but her silence weighed more than a sermon. By nightfall, neighbors came with food. One man brought 2 horses, another an extra tent. They pitched makeshift shelter on the bluff above where the barn had stood. It wasn't much. Canvas and boards and canvas again, but it kept the wind off. And then came the preacher. He arrived with his collar turned up and a face full of worry. "I heard what happened," he said. "It's wickedness, no mistake. But there's talk, Eliza." She stood by the fire, arms folded. "Talk?" Some folks say it's retribution, that it's not natural, building a home on top of a barn, that maybe you invited misfortune. She didn't answer. The wind did, a sharp gust that blew sparks sideways. I just thought you should know, he said. I do, she said. I know. She turned away and didn't look back. That night, after everyone else fell asleep, Eliza sat alone at the fire, staring at the outline of her old rooftop cabin, now just a black skeleton against the stars. And for the first time since the first storm hit, she felt something new. Not fear, not grief, not even anger. Resolve. In the days that followed, she didn't hide. She didn't retreat. She started building again. This time not on the barn, it was gone, but on the hill above, near a copse of trees that hadn't lost all their needles, on a rise that caught sun longer than anywhere else in the valley. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't ask for help. And yet, one by one, the townsfolk showed up with tools, with nails, with beams pulled from fallen cabins. The man who'd brought the horses offered rope. The woman who once prayed at her window brought bread. They remembered. They knew. Because when the valley had frozen, and every other home had buckled or burned or betrayed its people, Eliza's strange little sky cabin had stayed warm because of her, and now, when everything had collapsed again, they watched her rise once more. A few still muttered about bad luck. A few still kept their distance, but most stayed to help. Jonas came every day. He never spoke of the fire, never asked who. He only hammered, lifted, braced. Together they raised new walls, not high this time, but thick. They dug deep, insulated the floor with rock and ash. They built a stove into the wall, not standing alone. They learned, they adapted, and the others watched and learned too. One man began digging a root cellar like hers. Another copied her stove chimney design. The town, which once laughed, now built with her hands as blueprint. And when the snow began falling again, lighter this time, just a warning kiss, not a blizzard, they knew she'd done it again, built warmth from mockery, raised safety from ruin. But just as she began to rest, just as the walls stood and the roof sealed tight, a rider arrived from out of town, breathless and pale. There's sickness, he said, coming from the north. Cabin fever turned ugly. 3 dead already. We need a place to quarantine. And everyone turned slowly to look at Eliza's new cabin. The question was in their eyes. The silence that followed the rider's news was longer than anything the storm had ever managed to choke out of the valley. 3 dead already. Cabin fever, they said, but with symptoms that didn't fit. Blood around the mouth, not from coughing, but biting. Claw marks on the inside of door frames. A 4th man had been found raving in the snow, eyes wide and lips torn raw from screaming. And now, it was coming down the trail from the north, through logging camps, settlements, outposts, a sickness of the mind, body and soul. Whatever it was, it killed fast and ugly, and no one in the valley was ready for it. The preacher tried to speak first, but his voice cracked. We'll need a place, somewhere away from the children, to hold them until it's safe. No one said Eliza's name, but they all looked at her. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak either. Not right away. She just stared at her cabin, her new cabin, built with hands torn open in the cold, built from the bones of what they'd lost, built on the bluff to catch sun and wind and keep her boys safe. Now they wanted to fill it with sickness. I just finished it, she said finally. Her voice was low, too even. It's the first place we've had since... She didn't finish. The first place that's truly ours. Jonas stood behind her, arms folded. They'll die without it. She didn't look at him. So might we. Then Thomas spoke. We can build another. Eliza turned. He wasn't joking. We'll help. Me and Eli. You always said cabins aren't magic. They're just wood and thought. You can do it again. We can do it again. But if we don't let the sick stay here, we're not better than the folks who left us to freeze. He was 12, just 12, but he sounded older than the preacher. And Eliza, though her jaw was tight and her hands ached, and every muscle in her heart screamed no, gave the slightest nod. Clear it out, she said. Strip it bare. We make room. The town moved fast after that. The infected, only 2 at first, brought in slumped over mule backs, too weak to stand, were placed on pallets in the far end of Eliza's one-room cabin. The stove burned low, not for warmth now, but sterilization. Herbs were hung from the rafters. Cloth was soaked in lye and vinegar. No one called it a hospital. That word was too big, too clean, too far off. But that's what it became. Jonas helped mark a boundary, a circle around the cabin, scraped into the snow with pitch and ash. Anyone who crossed it had to wear scarf, gloves, hood. Anyone who left washed with snow and ash and fire heat before re-entering the camp. But even then, it wasn't enough. The sickness spread. said. Not fast, not like fire, but like frost. Quiet, creeping. First a cough, then tremors, then madness. A woman tore off her gloves and ran into the woods barefoot, howling like an animal. They found her 2 days later, frozen under a pine. A boy stopped eating, then talking, then breathing. By the 4th week, 6 more lay inside Eliza's cabin. She didn't move out. She stayed, slept on the porch, curled in a wool coat, eyes never closing more than a few minutes at a time. She tended to the sick when the others couldn't. Not with tenderness. She was too exhausted for that, but with a grim, methodical care that made the preacher say once, "She moves like a field surgeon." But she wasn't that. She was just a mother who'd run out of patience for death. She boiled cloth, fed broth, wiped blood. And when one of them died, a trapper named Goss with lungs that wheezed black tar for 3 days before stilling, she dragged his body herself to the far hill and burned it. No one helped, not because they didn't care, but because they couldn't watch her do it. Still, every morning she came back down, not one complaint. Until one night, Eli broke. He found her outside the cabin, sitting against a rock, her face gray with ash and fatigue. The moon was sharp above, the sky hard with stars, and the wind had dropped low. He sat beside her, silent for a while. Then, "Mama, are we ever gonna have a home again? A real home? One we don't have to give away?" She didn't answer at first. Then, "We are the home," he sniffled. "What?" "We're the roof, Eli. You and me and Thomas. We're the beams, the walls. We're what stays standing when everything else breaks. Don't matter where we sleep." He didn't understand it all, but he nodded. And in the morning, he helped her clean another fevered man's body. That week, a woman woke up healed. Then another, and another. Whatever the sickness was, it had passed its peak. The worst had died, yes, but the rest began to stir. Eyes cleared, coughs faded, appetite returned. One morning, the cabin emptied itself. Not all at once, but steadily, as people emerged, blinking, gaunt, leaning on one another, stepping out into sun. The town wept. She didn't go to the county seat for fame, or to boast, or even because she wanted to. She went because when she looked into Eli's face, she saw the same solemn question that had hung there all winter. Will we always be alone in this? And she knew the answer had to be no. She knew it like she knew how to hammer a beam straight, or how to pack a stove with hay-dried dung when the firewood ran out. Some things needed to be passed on, even if the hands that received them had once mocked yours. So Eliza Cooper packed her coat, kissed the boys goodbye, and rode out before dawn with Jonas at her side. She left no sign on her cabin, no marker on the trail, no blueprint behind. Only warmth. That would be her signature. The kind you felt in your bones after freezing for too long. Not flashy, not loud, just a quiet return to being alive. The road to the county seat was half mud, half thawing snow, and full of ruts left by wagons that hadn't survived the worst of winter. Twice they passed broken spokes buried like bones, and once they had to walk the mule through a stretch of black slush that threatened to suck down the hooves like tar. But Eliza didn't complain. Her silence was a habit now, a kind of fortress of its own. Jonas filled the air with soft remarks, small talk about the green returning to the valley, the way the birds had come back too early, confused by the warm patch around her new cabin. "They say the snow melts faster near your porch than anywhere else," he said with a sideways glance. She only replied, "That's because the wind doesn't know how to reach it." When they arrived in town, the courthouse was colder than any barn she'd ever known. Not in temperature, the sun had warmed the bricks, but in spirit. The men who waited there wore vests and pins and beards that had never seen smoke from a hay-burning stove. Their hands were pink and soft. They did not rise when she entered. A tall man with silver in his beard cleared his throat and said, "Mrs. Cooper, thank you for coming. We've reviewed testimony from several in your settlement. Quite extraordinary claims." "They're not claims," she said. "They're memories." He blinked. "Yes, of course." Another man asked how she knew to pitch her roof so steep, how she kept the flue from freezing, how she suspended a firebox safely over a hayloft. She told them, plain and precise, like laying out a table, no flourishes, no pride. Someone asked how she maintained heat with only 1 log a day. She explained the layered floor, the flat stones, the air trapped between straw and earth. She told them how a mule had survived a blizzard in that loft years ago because the hay and pitch roof made a womb of warmth above the freezing ground. Another leaned forward, frowning. "But why build on top of the barn in the first place? Surely it's not safe." "The structure? It's safer than burying children." She cut in. Silence. Her voice wasn't loud, but it rolled like thunder through that room. She told them about the floor frost in her first cabin, about the screams of wind under the doors, about how her boy stopped coughing only when she lifted him off the ground, how the stove they mocked, patched, tilted, too small for their charts, had boiled enough water to save a dozen sick men. How every piece of that rooftop shack had been scavenged, begged, dragged, or pulled by rope in the dark. "But it stood," she said. "When your chimneys fell and your bridges cracked, it stood." They asked about her faith. She said nothing. They asked about her husband. She said less. They asked whether she believed her design could be replicated for civic use. She said, "If you have enough stubborn women and enough broken barns, yes." By the end of the hour, none of them looked quite so clean. When she stepped out of that courthouse, a reporter tried to ask her name. "Eliza Cooper," she said, not pausing. "And what do you call your structure, your cabin?" She kept walking. "I call it enough." She never read the newspaper. Jonas said it ran under the title, "Widow on the Roof Saves Valley from Storm and Fever." There was a sketch. It didn't look like her. The eyes were too proud. They never captured the exhaustion. When they returned home, spring had taken most of the snow. The valley had turned soft and muddy and green in the shallow places. Children played again. Windows opened. Smoke drifted lazy from repaired chimneys. But Eliza didn't relax. She went first to her own cabin, stepped inside, breathed the still warm air from the stones and packed walls. She let her fingers trail over the new stove, then over the wall where Thomas had etched a line with a nail. January 8th, alive. And she let herself sit, for a while. Just sit. That night the boys made stew. Jonas joined them, leaning in the doorway with one shoulder. They ate in silence, like always. But the warmth wasn't just from the stones this time. It was from knowing the worst had come, and gone, and they'd held. A week later, the town voted to build a central structure for next winter, half buried, with a heat-trapping design, built to the shape of her cabin. They didn't call it the Cooper method. They didn't name it after her at all, but everyone knew. One child asked her once why her new cabin had no second floor. She said, "Because now we know how to build it warm the first time." A few months later, someone set a small wooden carving on the edge of her porch, a tiny replica of the barn roof cabin. Crooked roof, one window made of colored glass, a figure standing on top with a hammer, no name on the bottom, just the date of the storm. She kept it there. Years passed. Other storms came, some worse, some easier. But in every one, the valley stood better. They sealed their floors tighter. They packed their stones warmer. They built root cellars and loft vents and used ash water between their beams. And always someone told the story of the widow who climbed, of the cabin that stood above the barn, of how the town laughed and how she kept them alive, not with miracles, not with fire, but with enough